Hello and welcome to Stampscaping 101. We're going to look at a kind of an experiment. I wouldn't call it a disaster because anytime you try something new and it doesn't work out, I don't know, you can learn a lot more things than you initially anticipated. Sometimes you learn about what works and sometimes you learn about what doesn't work. And sometimes you learn about both and what you can do to remedy something. And that's the case with this piece right here. If you continue watching, you'll hear about a lot of hurdles that came about in the formation of this piece. Okay, we're working with a half-page dark glossy cardstock. This one happens to be kind of a really deep navy blue, which was made by Chrome Coat at one time. I bought it maybe 25 years ago when they were discontinuing it, so it's been long gone since then. But you can find a lot of black glossy cardstock out there. And if I didn't have this dark blue one, a whole ream of it, I don't know how many pieces I have still, I would get some dark, some black glossy cardstock. It's really fun to work with, and you can mount pieces on it, or you can stamp things on it. Okay, so I'm working with the Brilliance White pigment ink, okay, because it's going to dry on here. And what I'm doing here is I'm giving a really good foundation of white ink that I intend to dry. And I've done this before on rainbow holographic cardstock and putting a white foundation on and then stamping on top of it with a the transparent dye-based ink colors worked fine, but here I wanted to test it on, the opposite value in terms of the value spectrum of something very light and reflective to something very dark. So just kind of following along with my experimentation here. And let me see, the bottom part, the right side of this represents kind of the ground, and those billowy top areas represent clouds. And I just needed a big flat surface, and you saw me heat set it. Brilliance inks can heat set very quickly. Okay, now I have the large aspen stamp here, and what I'm going to use to color my stamps here are the Marvy 1500 series brush markers, and they have dye-based inks in them. Okay, we used to call these watercolor pens back when I was a kid. They are water-based and transparent, so I'm blending in some greens, oranges, a little bit of brown, and yellow, okay? And I'm going to mix it directly on the stamp to get a nice varied impression, okay? You won't be able to see very much of the variation because I just didn't make that surface in the background quite light enough with white. I don't know, it might work on there, and maybe I'll try this again, but I'll really hit the paper where I'm going to stamp dye-based ink impressions on much, much lighter, okay? All right, so the Brilliance inks I've found, when they dry, they kind of form, they're all on the surface, they're not absorbing into the paper at all here. So they kind of dry on the surface and give it kind of, I don't know, not only a surface, but a little bit of depth in which the dye-based ink can stamp into and penetrate, okay? But you can see I just clearly didn't make the background light enough there, so... Okay, so I did that same type of thing with, I don't know, two additional impressions with the large aspen and two with the small. And the dye-based inks, when you work with those types of markers like that, on a glossy surface like this, that also has Brilliance inks on it, they puddle up quite a bit because there's a lot of ink in those pens, okay? Now, I'm drying the inks on here, and they dried eventually with, enough heat setting. It probably took me, I don't know, maybe 2 minutes to dry top and from behind. But now looking at this, I was just thinking it is just much, much too dark. Okay, but sometimes I can remedy that with paint pens. So here I am trying out the paint pens on here. These are acrylic paint pens, and I just looked at that, and it was just like, there was just way too much contrast between that paint pen mark and the dye-based ink impressions. So here I am. I'm just kind of mixing up a darker green paint pen here, and we'll try that. Because I don't like to go with a color too much darker than the impressions, okay? So that first light green really stood out. And I'm adding in this green right here, this darker green. But it really wasn't the color that I really wanted to go onto these scenes with. Okay, but it did blend in pretty well from a value perspective, but I was just thinking it's applying okay and it's blending in fine. You can't really see it too well here, but I figured I could build on these green dots perhaps with the lighter colors. But I was just thinking, oh, I don't know. I think this is kind of a worthless pursuit here. And maybe we'll try something else. Here I'm trying to go back with the green, and it's just standing out like it's Christmas lights or something like that. It looks so light on that darker background impression. So it just wasn't working for me. It would never blend in to the impressions, okay? And we want them to merge somewhat, okay? They can be you can have a darker foundation, but it just wasn't happening. So, all right, so this is one that I really, thought about just tossing out because it was just so extreme. But I thought, let's try something here. Let me try stamping over these aspens again, and let me try lightening them up with some Brilliance inks, okay? I wasn't quite sure how this white Brilliance was going to transfer, if at all, on top of that dye-based ink. And you can see it lightened it up pretty good. Maybe, I don't know, a 20% value lighter, maybe. You can still see the colors showing through. And I did that over several. Now on this one, that was the first one that I did. I hit it again with another layer of Brilliance right over the top of that first Brilliance. So it lightened it up pretty good. And then I was just leaving the stamp on the surface a lot longer, allowing that ink to transfer more. So I got some lighter impressions like that. Now this is a nothing card at this point in time, and those impressions are just, it's like a nothing card. So I have to kind of build things up, not from scratch, but almost, because these are kind of white or very light green, yellow, orange trees now. Kind of built of pigment inks now, because the pigment ink is now the surface media. It's no longer the dye, okay? So right here, I'm going with the acrylic paint pens. The acrylic paint pens are pretty good because they can draw on just about anything. And before I applied these dots here, I did heat set those Brilliance white pigment ink impressions of the aspens. Okay, now I'm starting to build up. There's a lot of surface media built up on here. We have a lot of that Brilliance white on the surface. Now, while it's dry, it is still sitting on the surface. So what I've tried there was my 0.7 millimeter paint pen, which is this little hollow tip of a acrylic pen, and there was just too much of that Brilliance ink going up into the pen tip, so it kept clogging on me. Okay, now this 3 millimeter pen right here that I'm working with applied okay, but it was kind of still digging up some of the existing media on the surface. So I thought, all right, let's just try to paint these trunks onto these birch trees or aspen trees. One of the things about birch trees and aspen trees, things like that, the trunk color and the branch color, of course, is really important in terms of depicting the character of the tree. So I'm just painting with a paintbrush, the Dr. Martin's Bleed Proof White. And it worked okay, but again, there was a lot of that Brilliance ink on the surface, so while I was painting with this, it was kind of putting back into solution and dragging out some of that pigment ink. So I keep struggling with that through the creation of this piece. Okay, now these branches and trunks here do not have to be perfect because we're going to be applying additional paint pen marks, leaves, over the top of it. So I just need the structure to get down there. And what happened is during the process of this, I kept losing those branches and limbs that I kept reapplying, but I don't know, I kept building up some additional inks, or additional paints, I should say. Okay, so now what I'm doing is what I do on a lot of pieces that, I don't know, need something done to it from a lighting and textural standpoint, and that's just applying more of that white pigment ink. Okay, and again, it has to be Brilliance. If you're just using a regular pigment ink, an oil-based one, it's never going to dry on here, even if you heat set it, okay? Brilliance inks are water-based, and they have a quick-drying component in it somewhere in the, I don't know, whatever the chemistry of it. All right, so applying quite a bit down there. I don't know if it looks like snow, or if it looks like clouds. Looks like trees in the clouds now. Okay, now see this? This is kind of at the point where I can kind of see the light, you know. I think I could make something out of this piece, okay? And I'm applying more of that paint. And again, it's really built up on here at this point in time. So I don't know if you can tell, but like every time I make one of these little dots, it's kind of at the center of the dot application, there's this point where there's no paint that comes off. I don't know if it's because it's lifting it off or what, but every dot looks, I don't know if you know what the grain quinoa looks like. There's this little dot in the middle of each grain, but that's what it kind of looked like to me. So I end up kind of remedying that a little bit, you know, towards the end of this piece. But this is, again, where I start seeing it kind of coming together. I'm liking the look of these trees, and especially that aspen over to the larger one over to the left side. Having that kind of darker dye-based ink impression underneath it, where I can see some of those colors from the underside of it, I think it's giving it some pretty good dimensions. So, you know, those, I don't know, you can you can call it kind of sub-layer impressions. They're showing through, and I don't know, kind of adding to the overall look. Okay, now that was with a green. Now the yellow here is brighter and lighter. So applying this now, I'm starting to really see some dimension. The trees look three-dimensional to me. You have that darker kind of impression in the background, some darker leaves in the green ones, but now you're putting lighter and I guess brighter over the top of it, okay? Brighter is the relative kind of intensity and saturation of a given color. Lighter is the relative light and dark of something. So remember, brighter does not mean lighter, okay? But this is brighter and lighter because that yellow is more intense than that kind of more pastel, pale green. All right, but anyways, these trees are starting to look pretty decent to me. So, like I said, I'm liking where this piece is going at this point in time. Sometimes early on, and especially if you're experimenting and kind of stepping into some new, I don't know, ground, you really don't know what something's going to look like or how something's going to apply, if any. But I don't know. This is kind of following my own advice to people. When you kind of get into a piece and it's just not going in the direction that you want it to do, or that you didn't anticipate. In my pieces, I do have the notion at times that, hey, this might be headed towards the trash, but I thought, let's just keep working with it and see where it goes. Okay, the fences are going on right here. And I thought these fences really provided some good structure. The reason why those are working, first of all, they're a good visual lead-in. they kind of anchor the scene, but they're also something very crisp next to something that's a little bit more abstract in those trees. They're loose and less defined. So you have this element of strong definition here. And here I'm following suit with the tiny rock stamp. You see where I'm doing it in both light and dark impressions, from multiple impressions like that. But see that bottom portion right down there is really providing a good contrast to those trees. And it's really what the piece needed. At this point in time, I think it looks pretty good. I don't know. I probably overdid it a little bit with my leaves, which I often do with these aspen because it's really fun adding those dots on there. You feel like you're doing some impressionist stamping or something like that, or painting, when adding those dots like that. But anyways, what happens with those paints? Those paints are really good, but they tend to, when they dry, they can blend in with one another, where you lose some of the definition. Okay, now here's again with my white paint pen, and I'm adding this element on the top rungs, the fence. I don't know, rungs, the lighting on top of those. But do you see where that's really making the fence a lot more three-dimensional looking? Okay, let's do that on this right side there. But look at those, what that little line can do, like that. Doesn't that look so much more dimensional that way? Okay. See, I'm digging into that black Brilliance ink. The black Brilliance ink has been heat set and is dry, but again, some of that pigment ink is going up into my tip there, so I have to keep kind of scribbling that media out of my white paint pen tip here. But the paint pen's a pretty good one. It keeps flowing really well, but it can get clogged up if you're applying it over the top of media that's that can go back into solution or get scraped up into the tip there. But it works pretty good. I really love the acrylic paint pens that they have out there these days. It's so much better than the roller ball style of gel pens. Okay, now I added those white highlights down there on the fence, so I'm following suit, doing the same thing on the trees, and I thought that these additional white highlights on tops of the trees really worked very well. I thought it was giving the trees something in common with all of that white pigment ink in terms of adding white highlighting to the trees. And it also gives it something in common with the fence. And again, it's just making these trees look so much more three-dimensional. Okay, splatter painting. Going in with the splatter painting technique here. There's certain types of issues going on with the trunks and with these trees and things like that. But the splatter painting, you're adding a texture over the top of things, okay? And while it doesn't obscure everything in the background, it does bring an additional texture to the forefront. I don't know if those are stars or snowfall or both, okay? I didn't bother masking out the trees, so I guess it's kind of both. But see, when you add these things in here, and then I'm adding, I'm giving variation to some of that splatter painted dot by just hand doing some paint pen dots in there. So you have some of those large stars and some small ones, or some small, I don't know, snowfall and some larger snowfall. So it's bringing in scale and depth into the scene. And see, I lost my trunks and everything like that. That tends to happen when I keep adding in a lot of leaves, with those paint pens. So it's kind of, you keep going back and forth. You kind of add the trunks and branches, then you add some leaves, then you reintroduce the trunks and branches, then reintroduce some leaves. It's, an ongoing thing, but it can all add up to, kind of a more, I don't know, kind of dimensional looking tree. I'm always looking to try to do justice to, the forms that I'm depicting, while I'm not trying to do an exact replication of things, or something that, or a photographic representation of something. I do want to capture the spirit of the imagery that I'm either designing or stamping with. Okay, so here it's going back with that yellow. You can pretty much add it wherever you want. I try to cluster it a little bit too. I should really spray seal these and then add an additional layer of that yellow or whatever the brightest colors are, brightest and lightest on top. And that way, as that acrylic paint is drying, it won't kind of be prone to blending or merging with the layers of paint underneath it. Okay. All right, so here I am going in with some additional crystal rhinestones in different sizes. I really love the look of those. And while this piece, I think it looks okay, um, the piece, I don't know, it needed some sort of focal point, okay? There's a symmetry to the left and right side of this scene. Usually I do kind of something like rule of thirds or something like that, but the crystal rhinestones kind of create, they're kind of a point of interest, even though there's no dominant one anywhere in there. Um, I don't know. It's just something a little bit more interesting. It kind of makes the piece a little bit more interactive too. Someone holds the card up and they tilt it like I'm doing here, and the crystal rhinestones are very reflective. And I just didn't leave room for like a deer or something like that in there, so the rhinestones really serve that purpose. And then I didn't have room for like a quote stamp either. I really wanted to use a word stamp, but I already applied the crystals in there, so it's like, oh, let's add a kind of a North Star. I did that in my last scene too, and I don't know, it kind of provides, um, I wouldn't say it's too subtle of a focal point, but it is small. It's a small element, and doing it kind of off center, the piece isn't just so symmetrical, so having that little area out there kind of provides the finishing touch. Okay, thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the card.